Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Professor Mom. Today, we're going to be talking about negotiating a startup. I get this question a lot. How do you put together a startup package? First of all, it is a very stressful time, especially if you're crafting startup packages for different universities. And a lot of it is because every university has very different resources. And so you really have to make sure that you're going to be getting the resources that are going to help you be successful at that institution. A lot of the times when we're interviewing, we're very focused on the interview, right? We're worried about our chalk talk, our vision talk, or meeting with students and different faculty members. But one thing we need to think about as we're going through the interview process is, what does this university have that I need to be successful, and what is missing? And when you ask yourself that question, as you're moving through interviews, as you're looking at centers and user facilities, start making notes. They have this type of microscope, but they don't have this, or this microscope has this type of detector, but it doesn't have this type of detector, or I'm going to need an in situ loading frame or a loading stage. Those are the types of things that you want to be thinking about as you're moving through your visit, right? Remember, in our last videos, we talked a lot about making sure that you understand that you are interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you. And so really making note of the different things that the institution has. The way one of my mentors described the startup to me was, this is your one time to ask for everything that you want. So ask. So you really want to think about, again, all of the things you need. Not just, so I'm an experimentalist, so a lot of the things that I need is equipment. But you should think about travel. If you have to use facilities or collect data at places that are not, near your institution or in different countries, then you want to include that travel in your startup. If you need money for outreach activities, then you want to include that money in your startup. If you need equipment, is an easy one, right? Then you need to add that as well. Some of the things we don't think about is the room. What is the setup of the room that's going to be our lab? What are the electrical requirements that we're going to need? Are we going to need forced dry air? Are we going to need a fume hood? Will we need electrical changes? All of those things also need to be accounted for in your startup. So the first thing to do is to make a list of everything. And the way I did this was, I had an Excel spreadsheet and I tabbed the sheet into different categories. So categories for travel, categories for equipment, categories for outreach, categories for so many different things, user facilities at the institution, user facilities that weren't at the institution, the centers that the university had that I needed to add equipment to. All of those things you want to include in your startup. Another thing I did was, in the first tab, I actually listed what were my non-negotiables. And that sounds crazy to say that these are non-negotiables, because I think we've been trained so much to look at the faculty position as, I'm so grateful to be here. But again, they're grateful to have you. You are amazing and you're going to do great things, and you need the resources to do those great things. And so in that first tab, I just had non-negotiables. Like, I'm not negotiating on these things. If I don't have these things, then I'm not going to be successful here. And that's a very good point to make, because I've heard plenty of stories where people, are promised things verbally, and when they get to the institution, they're like, well, we don't have to honor that. That's not necessarily in your contract, or that's not in your startup package. So being very clear what your non-negotiables are. You want to be clear. Another thing is, you're crafting this document or this list or Excel spreadsheet, is how much do these things cost? And this is where a lot of work comes in, especially for an experimentalist. So I remember I had contacts at MTS where we get a lot of our load frames and equipment from, things like Bueller where we get a lot of polishing solutions and pads, where I actually would call and say, hey, if I was to put together a quote with all of these items, how much would it be? And I would break that down in the Excel spreadsheet. An MTS frame is, 100K. An extensometer is $7,000. If I was to get polishing solution for 2 years, um, it would be $1,000. All of these things you want to include. You want to actually include the actual number. The reason why that matters is because some institutions will give you a lump sum of money. So instead of, buying the specific equipment, they may say, I'm going to give you $1 million, right, to start up your group with. And you can use that $1 million as you see fit. And so for you having an idea of how much these things really cost, when you see that number, like someone says $1 million, it seems like a ton of money. But for an experimentalist, that is not a lot of money, right? So you really want to make sure that the number that they are presenting to you is a fair number. And again, it's going to allow you to buy the things that you need, but also give you some flexibility. So if you know, for example, I decided to get an ultrasonic fatigue frame. I included that in my startup. But then I decided, you know what, I want an NSCM load frame that attaches to my ultrasonic fatigue frame. So that wasn't something that I thought about when I was negotiating the startup. Well, the SEM frame is like 100K, right? So when I was crafting my startup, I made sure to think about, does this give me flexibility to buy things that I may not think about right now, right? So that's the way you want to. So give yourself some wiggle room in case there's things that come up that you may want in the future. So you really want to think about all of the things that are going to make you successful. Another thing when you're on the visit is, where is my lab going to be? So we talked a little bit about this in the interview videos, but this is where you actually want to get, what is the location, building, and the room number. You want to make sure you put that in the startup package. You want to make sure that you have been given where your lab is going to be and you know the room number. On top of that, you want to see the room. You can ask for plans for that room. So it'll tell you, where are the electrical outlets? Where's the voltage? Is there, can you get dry? Is there dry air coming to the room? Is there cooling water coming to the room? Chilled water supply to the room? You can get all of those things. Where are the sinks located? Do you have enough sinks? Where is there room for a fume hood? Does the room have an existing fume hood? And the way I like to think about the layout, and this is really more geared towards experimentalists, is think about when you were a graduate student. The flow of your lab. Was it easy? So for example, my students do a lot of polishing. We have an automatic polisher. Having a sink by it is very important, because when you need to wipe off polishing solution, having to walk all the way across the room, there's a risk of that solution drying on the surface and ruining your work. So having a sink next to the polisher, all of those things you want to think about in your mind. Like, what is the flow of this lab? Does it have all of the electrical requirements, mechanical requirements? And that's why it's important when you are building that list of equipment that you need, that you also understand what the requirements are for that piece of equipment or that instrument. So then when you're kind of designing this lab or outfitting it, you can be clear that, hey, I'm going to need 240 or 120 here. I'm going to put my saws here, so then I need to change the outlet, right? So an issue that we're running into now is that we bought a new furnace. And so now we have our old furnace, but we only have one 240 outlet. Like, in my mind, why did I only choose one 240 outlet, right? I didn't think about, in the future, as I build my lab, I'm going to add more equipment. And so those are the things that you want to think about. On top of that, you want to make sure, for example, if an institution is giving you a lump sum of money, you want to make sure that anything that they do to the lab does not come out of that money, right? You want to make sure that they are paying for the outfitting of your lab outside of the lump sum of money that you are getting. That is very important because getting work done to your lab is very expensive. It's $1,000 to have someone change an electrical outlet, and it takes them like 10 minutes. I remember having to, something I didn't do was make sure that the pump room that actually stores the pump that supplies pressure to my fatigue frames, I didn't think, oh, this pump room is across the hall from my lab. So then I had to pay out of my startup to have the lines coming across the hallway into my lab. It was like $13,000. And so again, things are very expensive. And so you want to make sure any changes, any outfitting of the lab is not coming out of the lump sum of money that you put. And that is something that you need to put, like on that first page, your non-negotiables, you need to put that exactly. You can spend $100K easy just changing very simple things in a lab, right? That's a load frame. So in the context of, like, again, what you need to be successful, think about, again, making sure that they are responsible for the lab and not necessarily you. So again, really making sure that you put these things on your in your startup package. Another thing that people sometimes don't think about is if you need hiring or help for hiring with a spouse. If your spouse is an academic, that's an entirely different uh, ball game that I can't speak to. But you definitely want to make sure that they're looking out for your spouse, that they're going to give them a position as an academic, that there's some type of plan to get them hired on. What I have seen in academia, even when I was a student and now as a professor, that it can have a huge effect on your marriage and your relationship if that person is not being fulfilled in their career as well. So you really want to make sure that you're thinking about your spouse. So if you have a spouse that works a non-academic job, that they're going to help them with career placement, whether it's at the institution, whether it's getting them a hiring coach, whether they have a person in the college or the university that specifically handles spousal hires. You want to make sure that's actually in your contract, and that, again, you're not paying for any of that. So you're not paying for a hiring coach out of your startup. All of those things really matter. So you really want to make sure that you have all of that laid out and you're not responsible for paying for anything for your spouse for hiring. Another thing to think about is non-technical workshops and conferences. Are there, like SWE, the Society of Women Engineers Conference is something that I go to, NESB, SHIP, all of those things that, help you with professional development, but may not be a technical workshop or conference. You want to make sure you include that in your startup package if you want to travel to these conferences, right? And a good thing to do with travel is to see, even for technical conferences and workshops, most societies will have, the location of the conference 5 or 6 years out. And so you can actually, when you're crafting, again, kind of listing out the value. If I was to stay in Las Vegas for 7 days, how much would it cost? If I was to fly, what is the average cost to fly from Columbus to Vegas? Think about the 3% change in inflation every year. And you want to put that in your Excel sheet and get the total number that it's going for 3 to 5 years of your time there as an assistant professor. So again, when you get that lump sum of money, you're making sure that it actually covers the things that you put in the startup package. And so you have to do a lot of homework, and it can be very stressful and it's very time consuming. To be honest, it's extremely time consuming. Another thing to think about is user facilities at your institution. How expensive is it to use microscopes? If you are a microscopist, then you have an idea of how much time it takes to get data if you're using the microscope. And so you want to put that in your Excel spreadsheet. To use the Titan, it's $100 an hour. I'm probably going to think averaging 50 hours a month, right? And then you look at that over how many years you want your startup to be active for. And so, again, putting that number in an Excel spreadsheet so that, again, when you get the lump sum of money, it is very clear that this money is going to cover the things that you put in your startup package. Another thing with startups is how long will it last? A long time ago, the standard was 3 years. When I started at Ohio State, I negotiated my startup to last 5 years because, if I'm honest, 3 years is just not enough. It may take you a year, year and a half to just get a good student. I remember when I started in COVID, so and shipping delays, logistical issues, the labor shortage was all affecting me. And so I remember I didn't even get my fatigue frame till I had been at OSU for almost a year and a half because the shipping delays were about a year out. So it took forever just to get the frame, and then you have to have someone set the frame up. All of that is just time. And trust me, when you set up equipment, it never works the first time. So there's just a lot of months, a lot of delays that happen. And so if you think about it, if my startup would have only lasted 3 years, I would have only had a year left to really start doing research on, using that equipment. And so you want to make sure that your startup lasts the amount of time that you need it. And there's flexibility to increase that. So, for example, if you have a child, and so you put an extension on your tenure clock, can you get an extension on your startup? Anything that delays you getting started, right? You want to make sure there's some flexibility. So, personally, I think 5 years is a better number, right? Because it really helps you get started, and it basically sees at least your first PhD student through their time at OSU or at your institution. And so that's very important when you are, thinking about the vision for your lab. So I think 5 years is a better number. Another thing to think about when you're crafting these startups is how many students do you get? Every institution does it very different. They may give you 3 students for 2 years, whatever the case may be. Or they say, this is your lump sum of money. You use it how you want to use it. Whatever the case may be, remember this is your startup. So if it doesn't work for you, if the standard in that department is 2 students for 3 years, and you're like, actually, no, I need 2 students for 5 years, 5 years apiece, negotiate that. If you feel like you need a postdoc, and I would highly recommend getting a postdoc for the first 2 years. Postdocs are just, they get things done a lot quicker than grad students. They're just more efficient, and a really good postdoc can really help you get your lab started. So I personally think everyone should ask for a postdoc for the first 2 or 3 years of their time, their faculty position. So I always say negotiate for a postdoc. And 2 graduate students. I think that's very important that you have a postdoc and 2 graduate students. Remember that, graduate students take a while to ramp up. So again, having a very good postdoc is important. And I'll have a video in the coming weeks talking about postdocs and, strategies and tips for hiring one. I had a postdoc for my first 2 years at Ohio State, and it really made a difference on some of my projects. So again, really negotiating for a postdoc. Another thing to think about outside of equipment, travel, funding for workshops and conferences is how are you going to do some of these things that you want to do if you're so tied down with classes? And so I negotiated 1 semester off of teaching. To be honest, I should have negotiated 2 semesters off of teaching. Teaching takes a lot of time, and it can be a time sink, especially the first time you teach a class, when you're trying to get your lab started, trying to train your students, writing proposals where you need to be spending a lot of your focus on. If you have to travel to different user facilities, you have to be very careful with teaching. Students hate Zoom. They hate virtual classes. They're all burnt out from COVID, which is totally understandable. But again, if I had to go back, I wouldn't have negotiated 2 semesters off of teaching. And so again, thinking about that, as you're crafting your startup, right? So you have the equipment, you have the labs, you have all these things that you're thinking about, user facilities, but what about like things that take away from your time? So again, negotiating time off from teaching, especially in those first 2 years. It's very important to think about those things. Another part to think about is relocation. So some institutions will give you a lump sum, like 5K for relocation. That's not enough for relocating. You want to think about where you're moving from, what's the average relocation cost. You can call, any of some of the major movers or even the company that that institution may work with and get an average of cost of how much it's going to cost to go from, so for me, DC to Columbus. And you want to take that number and add about $3,000 or $4,000 to it. So again, and make sure that relocation is something that the institution or college is paying for outside of your startup. So make sure that number is not coming from your startup. And you've heard me say that a million times because a lot of people get burned with that. So it's like, oh yeah, we're going to give you $10,000 for relocation, not knowing that that $10,000 is coming from the lump sum of money that they're giving you. So again, making sure that those types of things are separate from your actual startup package. Your startup should be spent on things that are going to help you start up your research career, your teaching career, whatever it may be, not to help you get to the institution to do your job, right? So you want to make sure that relocation is not being included in your actual startup or lump sum of money that they're giving you. Another thing, and I talked about this in interviewing, is down payment for housing. That is not something that I even thought about when I was interviewing, because at the time, Columbus had a really, I would say, moderate cost of living and housing was not that expensive. I started my position in 2021, so when the housing market was booming. And man, I wish I would have negotiated a down payment in my startup. I've had a few friends to do that, and I'm telling you that is so important. And you really want to look at the cost of living in that place. And cost of living can be skewed a little because it looks like if you look at Columbus cost of living, you'll think, oh, this is pretty fair. But if you look at housing like close to the institution, housing that are in areas with really good school districts or nice walkable neighborhoods, they are a lot more expensive than some of the areas where crime might be higher than those areas. So you want to think about, again, where you want to live in that city and how much does a house cost in that area, and think about your salary. And so you really want to make sure that if you need down payment assistance, that the institution can provide that. And that can, I think I talked about this in my last video, if being able to purchase a home connects you to the community. It gives you a sense of belonging. Without it, you almost feel like you're not rooted in the place. And so that will become more and more important, especially for me now that I have a son, right? So feeling connected to Columbus, having a home for my son, it's very important to me. And if that's important to you, then you want to make sure that you are negotiating for housing if you need that. And so I always say that is becoming more of a big deal than it used to be. So really thinking about down payment assistance. And again, I'll say it for the 100th time, make sure that that is separate from the lump sum of money that you're getting from the institution. Because if they're giving you a $75,000 startup, down payment assistance, you don't want that to be coming from the $1,000,000 that they are giving you. So just think about some of the things I've said. If all of this is coming out of your lump sum, we have dwindled that number down to like 600K, right? So again, you want to make sure these things are separate from the startup to help your lab get started. The reason why I think that having this information is important is because I didn't know where to start when I was negotiating a startup. If it wasn't for mentors that I had that were department chairs, I would have not even known what to ask for. And so again, I hope this video gives you, something to start with, right? Something to start thinking about as you're going on interviews. Again, as I talked about in my last video, what is important to you and what are the things that you're going to need to be successful at this institution. And I think tabbing that off in an Excel spreadsheet is very important because you get to kind of list out and get a number of value to those things. The last thing we're going to talk about is salary. So salary is important because where you start definitely has an effect on where you land. So here at OSU, we've been getting somewhere between a 3 to 4% increase every year. So people who started at 90,000 versus people who started at 120,000, in 5 years is going to have a much higher salary. And so one of the things to think about with your salary, all public institutions, the salary is public knowledge. Now that is the base salary. So anything extra will not be included in that. Private institutions are a little bit more difficult. If you're on the interview process and you feel like you're connecting and vibing with someone, you can ask them to give you a range of what assistant professors are making in the department, especially if you are speaking to maybe the faculty affairs person. But again, the salary is not about other people. The salary is about you. How much money do you need to live in this place, right? If the cost of living in West Lafayette, Indiana is very different than the cost of living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? So thinking about the lifestyle that you want to live, the things you're going to need. If you're thinking about children, how much does childcare cost in that area? Can you afford it based off the salary that they're proposing? You want to negotiate that. And if the salary is a non-negotiable, then you need to put that on that first tab. This is a non-negotiable. This is the salary that I'm going to need to be successful. And the way I look at salary is take that number that you need and then add like 20K to it, right? So giving yourself, some flexibility in case things come up. You never know what life is going to throw at you. So that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in to Dr. Professor Mom. I hope this video was very helpful. And if you have any questions about startup, anything that I didn't mention, always leave me a comment or a message. I'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you.